Yeah, well, hello everyone. My name is Ugo Stornaiolo. We're recording a new, very belated episode of En Orden, Libertad for Navarra Confidencial. And today I'm joined by Sven Gerst. I hope I pronounced your name right. And we'll talk
Yeah,
about
that's about right. Yeah.
all right, then we're going to talk about a bunch of different questions about him and about his role and his perspective on the freedom movement in Germany and in Europe. So welcome, Sven. It's been a while.
Yeah, it has been a while. Thanks for the invitation, Ugo.
You're welcome. So, well, my first question usually is just to allow for our guests to introduce themselves. So, if you could give us a little bit of your background, your story. I saw that there has been some changes in your activities recently, so you can tell us about that.
Well, it's always hard to describe myself. I would say I'm a philosopher by training. So I have a background in academic philosophy, mostly moral and political philosophy. But in recent years, I do much more on topics such as working in publishing ideas about especially organized or politically organized liberalism. Um, and I do a lot of facilitation of trainings. So I work outside the academia, but nevertheless as a philosopher. And I have lived in many different countries. Uh, I grew up in Germany, but I studied in Taiwan, Russia, the UK, the United States, and lived in countries such as Belarus, Turkey, or right now in Kurdistan. So, like, like quite a global perspective, as well as like a very heterogeneous intellectual background, I might say. So these are a couple of words about myself, but I think it will become much clearer when we go into the discussion. Then I give also an outlook how this always correlated to my own experiences.
Right. Well, that's quite a range of countries you've lived in, and your training, especially for someone who has a background in philosophy, like I would say it doesn't fit. It's more like it's very different from what would like what one would expect from a classically trained philosopher anyway. Like you've been way too active for someone who spends too much in the realm of ideas.
I think that's true, although I always refer back to people like Alexis de Tocqueville and others that emphasize the role of travels to shape one's ideas. And I think the pure ivory tower um, reasoning has its place, obviously. I mean, that's where philosophers battle with the ideas. But some experiences will help to shape, especially, I think, realities when it comes to political philosophy, when it comes to moral philosophy. There we can learn not only from anthropology, sociology, but like from our own lived experiences and to see how these ideas play out. Of course, this is lesser relevant when we talk about metaphysics or epistemology, but for the areas I'm in, I always think like Tocqueville was right. Travel plays a crucial role to make sense of the world.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. And well, your travels have been related to the activities you do, to both how you spread ideas, how you facilitate the understanding of these currents of thought. And my question, like maybe my first proper question in that sense, comes there. Like, how has your travels, your experience abroad, Germany, in shaping how you understand, at least the idea of freedom and the role freedom has for communities.
I think my first big experience that I always highlight is that in places where people don't experience, especially political liberty, there's a much more radical urge for it. I think we in the West and especially in Europe have been familiarizing ourselves with this concept of liberty, which again in the like broad span of human history is like a rather new. We have been familiarizing ourselves with liberty, and that made it for us almost like a given. For those people that don't experience liberty, they are much more radical in their pursuit for it. I think the urge is almost universal. Every human being wants to strive for at least some degrees of personal freedom. And what my travels showed me, or my life abroad showed me, is that we can learn a lot from those places where liberty is not prevalent and not a default, because they fight for it and they have much more pronounced ambition for a liberal project. So to make this concrete for the listeners, when I work with liberal movements globally, I can always see that those are more radical, the more authoritarian or restrictive the country is. So you see in like Turkey or Russia or wherever, there you see the anarcho-capitalists, the most radical versions of the liberal family. While in Europe or in the United States, but let's take Europe as an example, you see almost like people scaling back from their own radical ambition for liberalism. So that's the most status quo conservative version of liberalism. So and I learned that, like we have been too familiarized with liberty, and so it became fragile itself, maybe.
Well, when you talk about the liberal movement or like liberalism all over the world, how would you define it? Because there's this misunderstanding, like in the US and increasingly abroad, when people talk about liberals, they think like, oh, really progressive people, borderline or like outright socialists, and there's a different understanding of what liberalism is in Europe and well, what it used to be in like Latin America, for instance, and you might know how the state of that is in other countries, in Russia, in Central Asia as well. So, like, how would you describe, like the what liberalism is for someone that only has the American understanding of it?
I think first of all, liberalism is a big tent, right? Like there are many different versions of it, and I don't think we need a purity test to define like what is the exact correct version of it. I also reject terminology such as, like classical liberalism and whatever. For me, liberalism is a set of values on how a person wants to see society. Like it's normative, right? It has values. And I think the first most important value for liberals is, of course, liberty. And like, just to make that clear, that sounds like almost like a nonsensical claim to make. But John Rawls, I think, made it very clear for everybody how to think about this when in his 2 principles of justice, he says the liberty principle has lexical priority over all other principles, and later on the equality principle or the principle of equal opportunity comes in, right? So the difference principle, and here he says one important thing: the liberty principle has always so lexical priority over all other principles of justice. And that's how liberals think about it. For them, liberty is the most important thing to order society, right? And that's the first thing we have to log in. Liberty, unlike the egalitarians who put equality at the center, or communitarians who put community at the center, or conservatives who preserve or like conserve things at the center, or populist nationalists who put identity at the center, it's for liberals liberty, and we have to be clear about that, right? Then other things come in, such as the social ontology of individualism and human rights, which is a subset of that. Then the rule of law, tolerance, spontaneous order, that's like how to order, like, or respond to complex issues, responsibility, and skepticism about power in general. So these are like a couple of values. I usually say there are 8 values of liberalism. I just gave you like a rundown of those. And these 8 values of liberalism, they can be interpreted in different strength, right? For example, you can take the value of skepticism about power to the extreme, then you end up probably in the anarcho-capitalist camp, or you can take the skepticism about power in a more mild version, and that's those people that would maybe justify a little bit more state interference, right? So you naturally have with these interpretations of values a very big tent approach, which is no problem, which actually should be what liberals should think about. But in the end, it's a normative construct. And I think that's what we forgot. It's a set of values and not like technocratic policy. That's rather the problem that I see, rather than us not agreeing on a definition of what liberalism is that we really misunderstood that it is a normative value-based concept that unites this very broad family that again reaches from some parts of the Democrats in the US to the anarcho-capitalists in the family. Like, this is a really big tent, but as long as we commit to those 8 values and have discussions about that, I have less problems with it.
Well, also something I was checking a little bit to prepare for this interview. At some point, you mentioned liberalism needs more ambition than just policy tweaks. And when you mentioned, like how this works in the broad spectrum of liberalism, I was wondering if something has changed about your opinion on that. Like, not only try to apply policy and try to discuss with others who share at least the idea of liberty, but to actually have a project for like the whole spectrum.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I became more convinced that hypothesis is true, that we need a vision or almost like a utopia for the liberal project, because I think ultimately we now fall into the trap, and again different world regions have that threat more or less pronounced. Let's take Europe as an example, that we want to cater to the populists by saying, yeah, liberalism is under threat from the populists because we didn't deliver enough. Right, and I agree that there is a delivery issue of contemporary liberal democracy that we need to think about very hard, and especially liberals, because I think contemporary liberal democracy has slided into something that even liberals have a hard time to defend. So there is this urge from us to say, well, if we deliver better and have just a little bit better public policy, the populist threat will go away. And I don't think that this is true. I think there is an intellectual, ideological, normative rival out there with the populists and the anti-liberals, the illiberals, that want to challenge liberalism, and that's okay, right? I think in the world of ideas, in the world of normative concepts, there's always threats. And I think liberals have not yet understood, especially liberal parties have not understood, that in academia or like in intellectual circles, people are already talking about post-liberalism rather than, being interested in the latest policy threats or something. There is an ideological battle out there on how our societies should be ordered. And liberals have not understood that this is also an ideological battle, because they were lured into thinking that we live in a post-ideological world of the 90s, but it's really not the case. The 90s was like outlier in history, that there was no counter to liberalism broadly conceived. So these are a couple of thoughts to build that on.
Well, in that aspect, you've also said that the main challenge to liberalism these days is not socialism or it's not nationalism, it's like populism. And you even wrote like this populist playbook, and you describe how it threatens liberal democracy, and how it pretty much attacks all the foundations of what liberalism is. Could you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, so I think first we have to acknowledge that there has been a build-up of an illiberal moment. What many people now talk about as like the vibe shift is kind of a change in culture, perceptions, and narratives that moved away from like the liberal world that was full of hope and progress to a certain degree of the 90s and early 2000s. And after that, the narrative changed to something more crisis oriented, that this liberal order that was only in place for a couple of decades, in fact, has placed us in a moment of crisis, that there are some liberal elites that are responsible for that, who then want to keep the masses impoverished or whatever it is, away from power to manifest their own power, right? And that's like kind of the vibe shift that many people nowadays understood. Something in our culture has fundamentally changed to illiberalism, and I think we can see that like in 10 years ago, all the major corporations were very much focused on inclusion, putting the pride flag everywhere, and talking about minority rights and inclusive language, la la la. That was like the peak, maybe overcorrecting liberal moment. And then now we talk about Sidney Sweeney genes again. There has been something uncanny going on in culture, and so I think that is the primary thing that should always make us worry, because it seems like the populists or the illiberals have really won the narrative battle, so to speak. And so this culture shift happened, and with this culture shift, I think also political shifts have happened in some societies much earlier, like Poland, Hungary, Turkey, like where we see the authoritarian tendencies for much longer around, and they always had maybe weaker democracies as a starting point to be transformed. But we now see it also all over the West, like Europe and the US, that there is this populist pressure on liberal institutions. So it's not only liberal culture that is under attack, it's liberal institutions and mostly liberal democracy. Viktor Orban makes this very clear. He doesn't talk about liberal democracy. He wants illiberal democracy, so like literally a counterattack. And what is behind that is first, I think, ideological project, and then secondly, a political project. The ideological project is that, the primacy of our society is not anymore pluralism and individual liberty, but instead it is some form of construed communitarianism, that we need as a society a conception of the good life. You can find that in Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeule, and others. That there is something about, we have to think what is the good life as a society, and liberals always said that's something for individual decisions. So that's kind of the first ideological battle almost. And the political battle, and that's what you refer to, is the populist playbook. That is the dismantling of liberal institutions that basically have guarded the individual from overreach of other groups. And now a liberal democracy wants to undermine that protection mechanism, which is the rule of law, the protection of human rights, and the like. Because for a populist, and again, I don't use this word derogatory, I think I use it descriptively, the aim of a democracy is that the majority rules. And that's crucial. For liberals, it is not that. The liberal doesn't want that the majority rules over everything. For them, liberal democracy is a safeguard that when we have to find decisions as a society, we still have safeguards that the individual cannot be sacrificed to the masses, like the tyranny of the masses that Alexis de Tocqueville and John Stuart Mill talk about. So that was a long answer, and I apologize to the listeners for that. But as I said, I think the attack on liberalism has always been first cultural, then ideological, and then political. And the populist playbook is kind of the political project of how to roll back liberal democracy into illiberal democracy.
That's an interesting take, especially because many people, mostly on the right side of the political spectrum, they have become quite lenient and quite attracted to the idea of populism, despite many of them still adhering to some sort of liberal values, like either democracy or like free markets or whatnot. So that, like, to make this distinction is quite important, especially because you have created a more comprehensive understanding of populism as a phenomenon, not only as something that people describe to those that use, like the popular anger or the popular discontent as a platform to get into power. In any case, in Europe, all over Europe, there is this populist wave, and there are many movements, many parties who are gaining a lot of strength, at least in the last 10 years. And well, in your case, about the situation in Germany. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. Well, not only about the Free Democratic Party, which is the party which you might know best, given that it's the liberal party in Germany, but also about all of the other parties in the German side. What is going on there, and to what extent is the Free German Democracy Party kind of falling asleep into all of these developments?
Mm. I take it back one step, if you allow, to one thing that you said, and
Sure.
I think that's crucial, that the right in particular has fallen to the trap of populism, and I think that's true, right? And there's a difference between the reactionary right and the conservatives, and I think the conservatives unfortunately, or fortunately to a certain degree, align actually with the liberals, because the liberals have become the new conservatives in one sense, because the cultural intellectual hegemony of liberalism has made it kind of the default of many Western societies, right? And so the conservatives lacked their own place, because now it was the default that we had some sort of liberal democracy and multilateralism on the international stage, right? That was for at least 15 to 20 years kind of the default, and liberals tried to defend it, and conservatives also tried to defend it to some way, because it was the default, and you want to preserve these kind of structures that now worked and gave us peace and whatnot. So there was this kind of fusionism almost going on, and that fusionism from the right was broken up by the emergence of a reactionary right. And the reactionary right is really to break up the hegemony of the liberals. And if you look at the writings of people like Patrick Deneen, it's really that. they are really concerned that everything is liberal culture, and they want to break that apart. So it's not conservative in the classical sense that, oh, we have to do small little tweaks to the existing system and preserve a lot of the structures that are going on right now. No. It's reactionary and radical in one sense. So I think today when we talk about the populists, we often also talk about the radical right or the reactionary right. And these forces are taken over the conservative movement, and we see that with MAGA and the Republican Party. This is completely new dominant forces in the right-wing discourse. So just one observation on what is going on in that particular movement, and I think I see that everywhere in the world, that the more radical right actors taken over that particular strand of the political spectrum. But now back to your question about the FDP. The FDP, for the listeners, was kicked out of parliament for the second time in its history in the February snap elections that we had. So there were early elections. Usually the election cycle would end in September this year, but it ended in February because the coalition fell over an issue that we call in Germany the debt break, like how much debt we can take on. And the Liberal Democrats, so the Free Democratic Party in Germany, they stood against the Greens and the Social Democrats in the coalition to take on more debt. So that's the issue, that the coalition fell. We got punished as a Liberal Party for taking this stance in the election, the second worst, or the worst election result in history for the Free Democrats, 4.6% or something like that, right? And in the end, I don't think the Free Democratic Party is punished the same way that other liberal parties in Europe are punished because of populist pressures or something. It is punished because it is kind of a hollowed out liberal party. Okay, so it lacks, I think, fundamental things that any successful liberal political organization might have, like a positive vision for the future, like wide set of highly skilled personnel, the ability to actually govern, meta-political strategy outside of just like doing party politics. And all of these factors, I think, came together in this one moment, and because the zeitgeist was going in a different direction, they got punished and are still hovering only at 3% in the polls as it is of right now. So they are a victim of themselves rather than the structural forces. In other societies, really the structural forces that, for example, populism is really striving, and then maybe the liberal parties don't know how to respond and they get wiped out. But I think in Germany, the failure of the Free Democratic parties is mostly like self-induced, I must say.
Do you think that extends to the rest of the liberal parties in Europe? I mean, there are some arguably interesting mixes going on in some countries. I can talk about the situation, let's say, in Spain, for instance, in Poland, where you had something like a liberal libertarian movement at some point, and in Spain it disappeared with Ciudadanos, and pretty much all of their momentum was taken up by Vox. And then in Poland, in which you have like things like Confederacja, which includes a good amount of libertarians that are mostly like the backbone of the movement, but at the same time you have like hard reactionaries working side by side with those libertarians. So like do you think the case of Germany with the Free Democratic Party is unique, is exemplary, or is more like the trend about what will happen or what might happen with the freedom movement all over Europe?
Always hard to generalize, because I think every polis works kind of different, right? And first of all, I would say, like, from my outside understanding and like my assessment of like Polish politics, Confederacja is like a right-wing party, so like the libertarians do, again, I think, strategic mistakes, and they have for sociological reason always done like misalignment, like also on Donald Trump's issues and stuff like that. The libertarians are always an interesting sociological case, because they might just dock onto more mainstream liberal party, or they go for the outliers that where you have to make kind of a fusionism with the hard right, and often they opt for the hard right as their alliance rather than the mainstream liberal parties. And that's even also the case in Germany, that a lot of libertarians moved to the AfD, and like these are real the enemies of liberalism. So I just worry that the libertarians, because of their own sociological demand or like composition, and the people who lead these kind of movements in each country, if we think about the US with like the Mises Institute and stuff, they move into sometimes questionable directions of poor judgment, and I think, there's just poor judgment because ideologically, they don't belong, for example, I would say in Confederacja. But you're completely right. The liberal movement in Poland has, I think, in just this month got a massive blow. Nowoczesna party was basically given up, and it goes into a bigger civic coalition or civic platform as a party. So there is no liberal party that I would label as the representative of or the equivalent of a free democratic party in Poland anymore. Similarly with Ciudadanos in Spain. But we can look at, for example, the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is interesting because it has two liberal parties, and both of them give us two different strategies and two options for liberals. So the D66 and the VVD. Both of them try to understand what is their positioning in contemporary politics, right? And again, I would say you always fade out if you don't know your positioning. And the D66 goes for the progressive urban voter, right? That's the cosmopolitan liberals, right? These are highly educated voters in the urban centers. They are usually in favor of migration. They are in favor of globally integrated structures like the EU, the United Nations. They are progressive on kind of the culture war issues of the day, but they are still kind of marketeers. And like I don't think most of them are socialist, also because I don't think that this debate is so relevant to the Netherlands, right? As a very freedom-loving country. So the D66 has a very clear positioning who they target. The VVD now doesn't have that. They could attract the urban voters, but they are not clear on where they stand really on the migration issue. If you want to be like hardcore on migration, more restrictive, you would go with a more populist party like Wilders or Forum for Democracy and stuff like that. They are not so clear on issues of the culture war. Are they progressive or not so progressive? There were like lots of debates on topics such as the Israel and like trans issues and stuff, where it's not so clear within the VVD core voters where they fall. And when it comes to international protection, I think they are rather clear. But this not clear positioning, either catering to the populist voter or catering to the very progressive liberal voter, made it very hard for the VVD in recent times to locate themselves. In the end, I think they went for kind of the low-hanging fruit and got some disenfranchised populist voters, so people who are not yet ready to go for populist. And I think both of these kind of parties are needed for the liberal movement, but those that are clear positioned like the D66 will always thrive more than those who like are going back and forth between the core liberal demography, so the voter base, and a more populist voter base. Because once you cater too much to the populists, it almost swallows you up. And I think that's part for where the libertarians are moving over to some of the populist movements, such as the AfD in Germany. So coming back maybe to the FDP is not clearly positioned. It does very bad with the voter demography I just described. They are not doing well in urban cities with highly educated people. And they are also not doing well with the disenfranchised voters of the populists, like that you could not get back for the liberal movement. Actually, we lost most people to the AfD itself. So, this weak in strategic positioning in the party spectrum made it very hard. And I think liberal parties only can do well when they are clear where they are located. And I think D66 was well located. Just to throw in another example, USR in Romania was well located, so the Romanian Liberal Party. Some others are good and well located. One might even say the Lib Dems in the UK. But a lot of them are just lost where they are located in this new political spectrum. And I think that's what we see with their very bad election results all over Europe.
Yeah, and well, like the German case is quite exemplary for this, especially because, and this goes into my next question. Most liberal parties, they tend to be very inwards looking. They focus on, like smaller government, less taxes. Sometimes there is like that international aspect of, oh yeah, we have to open up more for free trade with other nations. And right now, at least in Europe, the main concern has become immigration, and immigration is not only an inwards looking issue. It has to do a lot with geopolitics as well. Like some countries like Poland take it very close with all of the wave of Ukrainian refugees from the war. Germany had a lot of Syrian refugees from the Syrian civil war as well. And all over Europe, you see that immigration is becoming the main issue. Most parties are positioning themselves in. So like, how would you understand the future of any like liberal movement or liberal party when their concerns are kind of misaligned with the current reality of Europe?
Yeah. I mean, you cannot survive if you're misaligned with the issues of the day. But I think you're also right. Like, we need to understand what are the main issues of the day and where do we position ourselves, right? I think a lot of, especially libertarians, they still think the main battleground is like the economic questions of like capitalism versus socialism, and everybody who is like falling a little bit on the like managed or social democracy kind of stuff is like the socialists itself, like the devil from around the corner. I just don't think that this question is like the most relevant for voters at this given time. And also that, like parts of dealing with markets and adjusting markets for the 21st century in like the platform economy world and AI world, and like all of this is immediately socialism. So I think there I just think we don't have our good spider senses of what are the topics of the day. I rather think, as you said, the topics of the day are really like about identity and belonging, and not so much material, although the material component always plays a role. But I think they are migration, they are like about sovereignty. Interestingly, a lot of right-wing parties, they don't call themselves nationalists anymore, but sovereignists. And I think that tells you something about what is going on. There's like something about sovereignty, about nation, so the nation state becomes more pronounced, and migration in general, and the culture war. How much change do we want as a society? I think the culture war is often stylized to something like, okay, here the two fractions are just battling out nonsensical topics, but it's about how much change can we stomach as a society. And I think liberals can do both ways, actually. There can be the more classical liberals that are skeptical of too much change and too much progress, because progress always leaves some people also behind that don't understand the realities of a very fast-moving society, or the more progressives who want like progress almost for its own sake. So as I said, like these three things of identity, belonging, like sovereignty, as well as like progress, are for me the most definite questions of many Western societies. Again, this doesn't apply to everywhere in the world, but mostly to Europe and the US. And here, then, liberal parties need to be clear. Are they ready to cater to a need that is either very cosmopolitan, like, okay, like we actually give a lot of power to a European Union in this current zeitgeist? That's a strategy that will only appeal to a particular fraction of the population. Or do they want to go more sovereignists? Like, again, also you can argue that from a liberal perspective, because it's more on the federalist approach. Or do we want to go more full all-in migration and like take away some of the worries about migration from the population that is actually not so much exposed to it? And lastly, do we want to go all in on progress and change, or might be more skeptical about? Both positions can be taken from a liberal perspective, but each movement needs to be clear. The D66 is at least clear. You know, like we have immigration is important. We just have to renegotiate the terms to a certain degree, right? But they are proactively tackling it. They are very progressive on all the culture war issues. So for that, in their voter base, it means talking about like trans issues, Palestine, yada yada, you know. So boom. And then lastly, they are very clear that they are very much in favor of the European Union and the UN and stuff. And so this clear positioning makes them quite powerful in the party spectrum. But I think another liberal party could play the opposite and still exist well. They could just say, from a liberal perspective, we are more skeptical towards migration. We are more sovereignist when it comes to like international institutions. We nevertheless want to have free trade. And lastly, on the culture war, we worry from overcorrecting and going too fast. And these two plays can place us nice against the populists, because the populists don't have the holy answer to all of these questions either. So we would, you know, like build almost like a firewall against the populists, like having always the hegemony of the discourse on these topics, because they are hardcore interventionists. For example, they don't want free trade, as we see with Donald Trump. Then we will have just tariffs and like scaling back of the international institutions. And their culture war is not worried about too much change. They want reactionary culture war. They are traditionalists when it comes to culture war. So they want to induce their values rather than, you know, just worry about the change of pace. So these are a couple of thoughts where the liberal movement could align. It's just, as you said, recognizing what are the important divisions and conflict lines in society right now.
Yeah, well, there's also the thing that aside of like the culture war issues, which they take a lot of time and attention. There is also the more practical aspect of politics, where many liberals, just by agreeing with a certain project, let's say the European Union, they're going against themselves in the sense, like, like increased regulation, burdens to progress, burdens to development. And this is not a topic that is well talked about, mostly because people are starting to think not really in party lines, not even in principle lines, but just like in belonging. It's like whether you agree with the European project as a whole, or whether you are like a sovereignist and you want out because whatever, like immigration mostly, but then it's also like there are other things that the European Union are not allowing for freedom to thrive. And like I'm thinking especially when it comes to the excessive regulation that is burdening technological progress in Europe compared to, let's say, the US or China. China, like, which has a known authoritarian style of government, they don't have as many burdens and regulations and limitations on technological progress as the European Union is imposing on its members. So, like, you could argue maybe from the liberal perspective, how liberal is that? Like, sure, the European Union as a product allows for free trade and free movement within the union, but right now it's also regulating excessively.
Yeah, 100%. And you know, like I think what you said in the beginning of your statement is just very important. The liberals and the liberal movement has to stop overgeneralizing. Like, you know, just because we have to defend whatever the European project from the sovereignists, it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that EU doesn't need like fundamental reform. The same way, if we need to safeguard liberal democracy from the populists, doesn't mean that we don't need a real serious update of liberal democracy. I think both of them, liberal democracy as well as the European Union, as well as the UN, are very broken systems. But it doesn't mean, you know, like you can take the wrecking ball, and that's why I say like the new right is reactionary. Like they are radical. They want to put a wrecking ball to the UN, to the liberal democracy, and to the European Union. That's again not conservative. It's hard radical right. And I understand like the system is in many cases in desperate need for an update, and we don't have good answers to the update. For example, think about, and you know, like for the European Union, everybody will have immediately to say less regulation, more markets, and you know, like just more efficient. Like I buy that 100%. There's much to think about actually, but and probably liberals have better answers for the European Union, but for liberal democracy, they don't have good answers. What is the liberal democracy of the next 30 years if it wants to sustain? We have the spiral that Ludwig von Mises was always talking about of bureaucracy, like, and intervention. You are entering into this constant spiral, and modern liberal democracies, after like operating for a couple of decades now, have become incredibly convoluted, incredibly blown up social security systems, where in France, the average pensioner earns more than the average, or like gets more than the average worker, or the median voter. And I think that is a big problem, and we don't have an answer. How do we reform? Do we want now, for example, more presidential systems with executive powers to get more speed back? Do we want to cut out the vetoocracy, like that too many vetoes can be put out forward in a liberal democracy? These are hard questions that we need to think about, and liberals don't have good answers. So I think you're completely right on this particular aspect, that if we just cluster and say, oh, they are against that, we have to save it, we forget that updating is our main responsibility, and like reforming these institutions. And I think that's what we don't do. That's what we don't do enough. And I think we are in desperate need for that on all levels, on the UN level, on the European Union, or like on the international level, international rules. It's not only the UN, it's WTO, on liberal democracy, and on the European Union. So on the supranational level, on all of these, we need to think harder what these structures should look like in the future, and then we should be the main driving force and not the radical right.
Right, but at the same time, this is what's making liberalism to become, I would say, less known, but quite misunderstood, and for many, quite very much the problem. Like, liberalism has, just by at least liberals, not liberalism as a project, but liberals, they have just decided to support certain institutions at face value, and by doing so, they have become more like, like gatekeepers of the system, instead of, a vanguard in the socialist sense of a project. That like, you don't hope for something with liberalism at this point. People don't hope for more freedom, and they are certainly not hoping for more freedom from the liberals anymore. Like, at least, like, socialists still try to promote this utopian vision of equality, and many people, especially in the US, they're falling again for the idea that, yeah, there's a class struggle, yeah, we need more equality. Or people in Europe seeing all of the situation with immigration and with assimilation issues, they're saying, no, we have to retake back our countries, and we have to promote our European vision of things, or like German or Polish or Spanish, French vision, which is like very identitarian. On the other side, like, no one really thinks, oh yeah, like the liberals, oh, they're offering us freedom and stuff. So like, my question in that sense, like, how or why do you think like liberals have, kind of given up on their idea to make liberalism more of like a lovable project, or at least something attractive for people?
I think the two things, and I fully agree. I think your assessment is spot on. I think there are two different directions, or two different problems. One is the kind of anti-utopianism of liberalism itself, right? And liberalism historically doesn't have to be an anti-utopian project. It comes out of the Enlightenment, and if you think about Enlightenment, the Enlightenment idea, it is actually very utopian, like a society governed by reason and rationality. I mean, if there's one thing utopian, then to think that we would be governed by reason and rationality, that is in the post-literate society we live in right now, mis and disinformation and whatever, that seems like a utopian project itself. But joking aside, the utopianism has been, I think, part of liberal thinking, but has been hollowed out or narrowed out in especially the what Samuel Moyn would call Cold War liberal discourses, where people became fundamentally anti-utopian out of the experience of the Third Reich and the Soviet Union. And I think we haven't recovered from that. Whenever you want to present a big utopia, a big vision, then you are pushed to the edges of liberalism. They might be just very skeptical. And I think we have to overcome that. I wrote some articles that we need a liberal utopia precisely for what you just argued. Like liberals also have to offer something. The other side has an identitarian project, or the other one has the socialist utopia always to offer, whereas ours. And the second part that you highlighted is that we are not a lovable project. And I think that's part of a fact that we only conceive liberalism as a political project of political institutions and not as something of personal virtue, but I think there are virtues that make a person or a liberal, and comes back to, again, the history of liberalism. The original word for liberal, especially like in the French Enlightenment, was something like generosity, like something about not only, how our society should be organized, but liberal, and I think actually people from non-Western societies understand it much better, comes with a lot of things about personal behavior and virtues. While often in those societies, the enemies of liberalism have kind of associated liberal with very bad behaviors and vices rather than virtues, like, people that don't believe in religion, people that drink too much, people that have intercourse with everybody, I think there is a deeper point that liberals have to live up to their own ideals in their personal behavior. If we are serious about equality of opportunity, then we shouldn't send our own kids to, or gatekeeping our own kids in private schools and elite universities that are not open to everybody, right? Or like do everything that we can send them there. If we want to preach that we need to do some sort of service to the community in terms of like redistribution, then we can't be at the top as liberals, the number one tax evaders, stuff like this. Our own personal behaviors need to be in line with our values, and that would make us a lovable project. So two things, as I said, utopia, like what is the grand vision? We have to return to that. And second, living up to what we preach, that liberalism is not only a political project of like cold institutions, but of people who act out those values in real life.
And that goes into something else that I have realized, is that you always see, like, well, liberals have adopted this certain aloofness to themselves. Maybe that's them living their values, as you were saying, but like not in the best way possible. And when it comes to promoting the ideas, you don't have good liberal influencers, so to speak. I mean, you might have progressive influencers. You are having, and this is something I rather dislike, despite mostly agreeing with many of them, people on the right who have really made a business for themselves out of like online influencing. But like you rarely see that from liberals. Like you don't see people who are willing to put themselves in the open online, and not only online, because I'm going to go against this in all, but you don't see many people like who believe in freedom as their main political principle, to put themselves in the open, both online and in person, trying to promote the ideas as a way of life as well. Like, I know your case is different because you travel and you spread the ideas in person. You do not only constrain yourself to the digital space, but it's not something that most people do. And I think liberals in specific have a huge disadvantage when it comes to that. Like, right-wing influencers, left-wing influencers. You rarely see like liberal influencers by themselves. And even more rare, you almost don't see people who spread out the ideas in person. Like, why do you think this happens? Why do you think liberals have adopted this certain aloofness, this certain distance from the masses, despite being part of the spectrum of political products that the voters could get?
I mean, different societies and different realities. But for example, look at Javier Milei, right? Like he became, through being kind of a talking head, like somebody who was always like in talk shows and has its online presence, was invited to podcasts, to somebody who's now president of Argentina and spreading liberal ideas, right? So I think we can learn a lot from that. But the problem is, for many societies in the West, and again, it's different in other parts of the world. If like listeners dial in from whatever, some parts of Asia or like Latin America, sometimes it's just different in each society. But in many Western liberal democracies, if I make a broad brush statement, there was no need for liberals to be active in what I would call the metapolitical, right? Like the pre-political space, because they were in power. Now it feels like, oh, but liberal parties were not in power. But well, like a broadly liberal or centrist coalition that was resting on the neoliberal consensus, right? Like even if you look at my country, like the CDU, the Christian Democrats, I mean, it's hard for somebody who is now on the right to say, oh, this was a right-wing party, right? This was a center-right, very vanilla conservative party within that neoliberal consensus, right? So liberals were kind of in power in many Western liberal democracies. At least their ideas were in power, and they didn't see the need for defending it. I feel like that's not deliberate, not intentional. They don't come together at a meeting and say, oh, we are already winning, no need to spend more on digital activism or stuff. But it's a sense, right, that there was consensus on a lot of stuff. And if you feel the consensus is in your favor, you are doing less of these kind of preaching things. And preaching sounds very, very bad to some people, but it's like convincing people. But the right and the left, they felt like left out. And I think especially the reactionary right, the hard right, they felt that they are left out. That's why Patrick Deneen wrote Why Liberalism Failed, with that kind of opening, right? That everything is kind of the liberal hegemony. And so the Charlie Kirks, the conservative and some of them radical right wings, they fell out of the discourse, and so they get active to take back some of those talking points because they don't feel represented, right? Now we have always felt represented. Like even if you disagree with the major politicians, you feel at least that your talking points are represented. So now I think tides have changed for the last 10 years. Liberalism has become under pressure, and people have to step up. But the problem is we don't have a conceptual framework how to think about it, because we come out of a tradition that doesn't think in such organized political change manners. Like we want to organize by the argument, but we don't have a whole framework that we could plug that on. The left wing has it. They have Gramsci. They understand cultural hegemony. They understand cultural change. The right appropriated Gramsci for their own purposes. And I think now it's kind of a liberal way of approaching or taking some of these ideas of taking back intellectual hegemony. And I think we can learn not only from Gramsci, but from our own history, and look how Friedrich August von Hayek, Montpellerin, these intellectuals did it, because they influenced a whole generation of politicians, from Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, to the neoliberal consensus of the 90s and 2010s. So we need more people like this, not only digital influencers, but also the Hayeks of the time. Like, who would that role be? Who is in that role to bring the intellectual forces of liberalism together, or organize the whole movement as a figurehead? Milton Friedman was, we always think about right-wing influencers and think about these people like, Nick Fuentes, but the liberals had it in the 70s with Milton Friedman. He was the main person to induce society with the talking points, and had spoke in a sense to the right audience outside of the ivory tower only. And I think we had that in the past. We need it once again, because we are losing the intellectual battle.
Well, you mentioned Millet. I would consider him a good example, but he's not a pure example. Then again, Millet has become quite close, to the right. I wouldn't say to a specific kind of people to the right, but Millet, he's comfortable with anyone who's simply not on the left. So, to what extent do you think there must be some sort, again, fusionism or alliance, or at least, as an understanding between liberals and on the right when it comes to promoting certain ideas and a certain vision, especially now? And the situation happens that it will be different from country to country. It's not the same strategy that you can apply in the US that you can apply in Germany or in Poland, or let's say in Central Asia or in Africa, in other countries in Latin America. Would you say that the Millet case, in that sense of having a proper figurehead who is quite good in the understanding of liberal ideas, that will work by itself, or that you naturally will need to get aligned with someone else, either left or right?
I think Millet is interesting. I mean, I coined him a dark liberal, like because he borrows some stuff from, I think, the discourses from the liberals. I think, for example, he has a very Schmittian understanding of politics and stuff. So, like, I think Millet is interesting conceptually also because he's kind of innovating on the go on liberal principles. Like, so very interesting. But his alliance, and I think that's what I want to comment on. I think his alliance is more pragmatic, right? Like, for example, he needs to align with Donald Trump. Like Argentina without the support of the US, we just saw, like, that's difficult. Plus, I think he understands the geopolitical realities. If you don't want to align with China in this kind of new Cold War that we are in, you align with the US as a country like Argentina. It's very pragmatic, and I think we need to be that, right? Like, geopolitical realities, we cannot, like, liberals have become too much good at moralizing rather than developing a theory of strength. And in geopolitics, you need strength. And Argentina understood very well where to position themselves. So that's one thing. He's very pragmatic and he understands geopolitical realities well. Second, I think he's an outlier. He has always been, and outcasts will meet other outcasts. And so you meet a Viktor Orban, who's an outcast in Europe, or you meet a Donald Trump, who's in the global elites, also an outcast. So I think, like, Javier Milei meets with those people not only because they are anti-left, I think that's also maybe part of the story, but he meets because they are also kind of the non-elites. Because his aesthetic is also that he has been always attacked by the elite. So it's a sociological factor, and I think many people prescribe too much ideology on all of this, because I think on foreign policy, Millet is much clearer than Donald Trump. Like, Javier Milei invited Zelensky. He knows that the enemy of liberalism is in the Kremlin, right? And not in Kiev. You don't, like, somebody like Javier Milei would not embarrass Zelensky when he comes to his country, like J.D. Vance. So these kind of things you see, Millet understands. He understands where to stand in the conflict of Israel versus Palestine. He understands how to think about international alliances from a Western perspective. So why that's not a Viktor Orban, Viktor Orban is, again, like somebody who is flip-flopping on topics such as Russia, but Javier Milei doesn't. He surrounds himself, nevertheless, with those people, I think, mainly for sociological reasons, because they are also outcasts. I think we would do good in mainstreaming Millet in Europe. I try to argue that in Germany, like, we have no understanding of Millet, and if Millet should come, there shouldn't be like protests, or like our chancellor should not say no to meeting him. Millet is a very interesting, respectable figure who has a very great success story in Argentina. He can always turn dark. That's the problem of the dark liberals. But as with the libertarians, I think there's a lot of sociology at play, and we can hold them back and bring them back in the real liberal big tent. Because Millet is still an outcast in the liberal family, and I've argued for a long time that he doesn't need to be. He's one of us, and like, to integrate him, and that he meets with the people, for example, of the D66, the more progressive parts of the movement, would be great. There's not the antagonist. Both of them want liberty first. So a couple of thoughts on this.
Okay, well, Millet, as you know, he was a very active figure before entering politics and all of that. And my question for you is, like, how do you take the liberals out of their ivory tower? How do you get more active on the ground? I wouldn't say online, because online is a different sphere, and well, younger people might be good on that, with all of the TikTok stuff. But your case is interesting because you have been places, you travel a lot, you spread the ideas on the ground. What do you like? What can you say about that? Like, how do you take liberals out of their ivory tower?
It will be very hard because, and maybe that's, I didn't like fully answer your first question, but maybe it's related to that. Like, your previous question was also on how we can do stuff online, and then I went onto a tangent with Millet. So let me just tie all of that together. I think it is very hard for us to gain traction because we don't support each other properly. there's an interesting chart of how information travels that one of my friends, Benjamin, just showed me recently. And what is very interesting is that some people share information based on identity. Like like if somebody says something and they like the message, they will immediately reshare. While the liberal consensus often is like, I like the information, I check the information, then maybe I check the information because I think it is true or something like that, right? But it is very hard for our people to get enough traction, because even if you see a liberal influencer, for you to make that step to share that content is much higher, like out of our kind of almost mental composition. And so while the far right and the far left, they have their own groups to push their own content and their own influencers, we are more hostile to our own people and like arguing with them rather than pushing their message. And I think that's again an observation of the weakness of this overall movement, because we have a lot of charismatic people and they also do stuff online, but I see that their support is not comparable to that of the right or the left, who say like, wow, you're part of us, we share your message to amplify it. For us, we love to argue even with each other rather than sharing the message. So that's one thing. But now coming back to the how can we inspire people on the ground, I think that is quite easy. If you bring the right people in a room together and talk about all of those challenges in an empathetic way, where you display yourself, and I think I try always to be a role model in that, that we are not only preaching liberalism, but also behave liberal. Like when somebody has a crazy different opinion to me, I have radical tolerance. Like it's impossible that I will stop the argument with somebody or like lose my temper or whatever. And that is display of my values. And I think that is what made me kind of a powerful orator for these ideas, because I display generosity, not on monetarily, I don't have too much, I'm a philosopher, right? But in my generosity in like thought and construing the other ways person's argument, that shows that you take your ideas very serious, right? Or that the way you carry yourself, humor, nonchalance, thinking big, these are all like virtues that you need to encapsulate, and then you will always inspire people, right? And I think we have been a very dry and boring movement. When we met in person, we never had fun, and we're embodying our values. Rather, we talked about, here's a presentation of public policy or whatever, and then you walk through and over intellectualize. And I think that's not what we need the physical spaces for. It's that people experience how beautiful it is to be around other liberals, because they are lovable people, as you said, I think a couple of moments ago. So that's, I think, what I always try to do, but that doesn't scale. And I think you talked a couple of times about online, and I think that's true. Like I think in online, at least you can scale in the online spaces, but at least you can inspire people by embodying your true values on the ground. And I think that always will have a place in the movement.
Well, to finish up with a lighter note, since you've traveled a lot for your work spreading liberal ideas, which place do you think has been the easiest for to do so, and which place do you think has been the most difficult in your experience?
I mean, difficult question. I think like I always would reframe, or when I ask similar questions, I always reframe to what are the most liberal countries? Where do liberal ideas travel the easiest? And I think that's just the Netherlands, right? That doesn't mean it is easy to be a liberal in the Netherlands, because everybody is also very kind of, I feel like in that movement, especially contrarian, but and like almost like cynical. But the Dutch are just true to their political history, and that they have a well-established ecosystem there. Also, this is just a very liberal country, and I think everybody who has been to the Netherlands knows it's maybe the most liberal country. Many libertarians would say, oh, where's somebody like Switzerland or whatever. I just think that it's not even close. Like the culture of openness in the Netherlands is just on a different level than in Switzerland. Where it is more difficult, I mean, there are many difficult places where people have not been exposed to liberal ideas and live under years for military dictatorship. I've been to Myanmar or whatever. Like, this is very difficult places, but that will not answer your question in a meaningful way, because if I just say, yeah, like, it's hard to spread the ideas of liberty in a military dictatorship, that's a non-starter, right? Or North Korea. I think more crucial is to look at those countries, especially in Asia, where certain tenets of liberalism struggle. And that is, for example, that liberals have to reinterpret much more context dependent what liberal ideas are. You cannot just go, like, for example, to Taiwan or South Korea and say, well, here we bring our Western canon, and that has a very strict, sense of radical, almost radical individualism, and now let's carry that out. It will not fly with a society that has a different sociological tradition, right? And it's like also just has the negotiation of individual freedom on a much more collective basis. So here we need to adjust and rely also on more thinkers and make more prominence to thinkers in that regions. I don't know how you think about Latin America, but I think Latin America in its sense of individualism is much closer to Europe than to Asia. So I think for me, one of the challenging regions is really Asia, where liberalism needs kind of a translation for that region much more than it would need for other world regions. So I hope that gives a little bit more meaningful, like, framing to your interesting question, because if I just say, oh, liberalism doesn't flourish in North Korea, that's so trivial that we can't take much away from that.
Well, thank you, Sven, very much for having joined me today. It's been a pleasure talking to you, especially because like this channel, as you may know, we lean a little bit more to the right. I've been trying to approach people from other perspectives just to get a sense of where we are together, where we are not, and especially how that works in Europe, in Latin America, which is pretty much where our audience is. So thank you very much. Again, it's been a pleasure, and hope to have you again in the program anytime soon.
Thank you, Ugo, for the interesting conversation.